Let's talk about it right now, and we'll take a break right after this. What do we mean by this, and why is it important to understand Proverbs in this way? That Proverbs are general principles, not absolute promises. What do we mean by that? I think some of you wrote this on that paper I just handed back to you. If you were teaching in your church and you wanted to help people to understand this, hopefully you do, if this is a valuable thing to know about Proverbs, how would you go about explaining it? Don't be bashful. What'd you put down? Franklin? Is it? Oh, I'm sorry, Franklin. Looked at the wrong person. Franklin, is it a problem to not believe that the Bible are God's promises?
The Bible, in my understanding, never
Okay.
some of them are sanctioned by God. So the wise man said, if we understand the Proverbs as the observations of life, it is contained and sanctioned by God, and so it is, in some sense, it's not a promise, but it's a right observation of God.
Okay.
So in that understanding, it might serve as a general principles instead of absolute promises.
Okay.
However, there are some proverbs sound very much like absolute promises.
Okay.
Especially when you relate it to God's heart.
Okay. Good observation. Do you have some examples?
Oh yes. For example, wills gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it. It's a kind of a general observation sanctioned by God. Yes, usually the people who get wills very quickly, kind of do not have the wisdom how to handle such wills. So
Okay.
they tend to, dwindle, but not necessarily. Some people do. And
Okay.
for the absolute promises, for example, a good man obtains favor from the Lord, but a man of evil devises who condemns. God never changes. So
Okay.
a good man always do that, and a man of evil always be condemned by the Lord.
Okay.
Yeah. So this one seems to, it is an observation from the sage that he knows this stuff, but because it relates to the absolute factors of God,
Mhm.
so kind of maybe you could say it's a promise and also
Mhm.
so.
Mhm. And I think you brought up a very good evaluating point, and that is, if a statement is being made, an observation or a statement of behavior, and it totally depends on God, we would not expect God to change. So we would expect that this statement is going to probably be closer. You raised a good one. What would God's response be to a righteous person versus an ungodly person? And both of those are going to remain true. My wife and I chose a life verse that some of you may have chosen also, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. I'm going to hold on to that being very close, if not absolutely a promise, because it depends on God, and God doesn't change. There will be a trust that God is going to remain faithful to who He is. Where we begin to run into problems, and Franklin, you pointed out a good one, is when we are now talking about observations about life in a sinful world or human behavior. And we're going to back off a little when we say, when someone wants to say, life is always like that. Always is a promise. Maybe the word promise here isn't the best word, but an absolute statement that is always true. Or another thing I think that we could point out is that sometimes life isn't fair in a sinful world. I'm looking for a verse here that I wanted to quote, and it has to do with, I can almost quote it verbatim, but I don't see where I wrote it down here. A rich man has many friends, but a poor man is lonely, or something like that. A poor man, I'm not quoting it accurately. Is it always true? Well, no, it's not always true. Is it good? Is it right? Is it the way God would want, or the way we would want things to be? Well, no, because the reason the rich man has many friends is they become leeches on him. They want to take money from him, or they want to gain something from him. And it's not fair that the poor man over here doesn't have people who support him. However, that statement is an observation of what life is like. And in that sense, it's accurate. It's often accurate, but we wouldn't want to push it. Oh, maybe this is it right here, Proverbs 14:20. Let me see how close I got to it. Yeah, the poor is disliked even by his neighbor, but the rich has many friends. So the nature of Proverbs are that they are observations about life and about God and about the relationship between life and God. If they are completely grounded in God, then we're on pretty safe ground to say, now I'm going to trust in that. And it's as close as I'm going to get to a promise. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. Acknowledge Him. He will direct your paths. I'm going to trust God that He will do that in my life because it's dependent on God. But as I observe other things like human behavior that is tainted by sinfulness and not predictable always, there will be exceptions to it, I'm going to want to back off with that. And let me finish probably with the most famous illustration, at least I'll finish, and I'd like you to comment if you have others, is that passage about training up a child, Proverbs 22:6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Boy, do I have a lot of conversations with parents to remember looking back on that passage. Well, I don't understand what's happened to little Johnny. He was raised in the church, and now look at his life. He's just turned away from God. Didn't God promise that if we trained him up in some kind of spiritual nurture, that he will not depart from that? And while I wouldn't unload all the things I know about that verse right at that moment, because you need to be sensitive when people are really in hurting situations, I would privately say I don't believe that verse promises Johnny will always be what that mother wants him to be. That even though we give the best of training to our kids, the best of nurture, we are not guaranteed that they're going to go on and walk with the Lord. And there are even Proverbs that remind us of why that is. Proverbs 30 verse 11 is a great example. There are those who hate their father and despise their mother. So what is that verse saying? Well, that means that a child might make a choice to despise the upbringing that a parent might have given. There would be a counteracting factor that could explain the willfulness of a child, could explain that. Having said that, however, I want to come back to this. When we were raising our daughters, my wife and I invested huge amounts of time in exposing them to the things of God. Reading Scripture together, praying, taking them to Sunday school, all the things that you would think of raising a kid. Now, if that's not a promise, then why do I do that? Why did my wife and I do that? Well, because we believe that that's the way it normally works. And that's what we mean by principles. This is the way life normally works. This is the way life often works. But let's stop short of this is the way life always works. And that's where, in understanding the Proverbs, I think for many of those proverbial statements, we have to help people to understand that even the original hearers, the people living in Solomon's day, when they would have listened to this, they weren't taking these as absolute statements of the way life always works. They were taking these as observations about the way life often works. And those observations are useful. In fact, they're very, very helpful. But we can't 100% depend on those because we live in a sinful world. And that sinful world sometimes departs from the truth of God. Other comments on this whole area of observations about life and how they work? Do you have any other passages that would be a good example where you wouldn't want to press it to be a promise, but it would be more of an observation? Okay, Sean? Right after it. Yeah. Yeah, exactly right. And it's often brought up as a contradiction in the Bible. So which is it? Answer a fool according to his folly, or don't answer a fool according to his folly? Excellent. Yep, I think you've nailed it. Depending on the situation, depending on our discernment of how to handle this, there are some times we might do one thing, and there are other times we might do another. And both of them can be right. Both of them can be right. And that's what those Proverbs, I think, are saying, that there are times when we might respond in different ways to a fool. Now, I think that's a good observation, where we're not going to put this in cement and say this is the only way that it can be. Observations about life. Yes, Zach. I think.
The way it's in there that about the way that the Proverbs were written for those who have the word of God. It does, you have to apply wisdom to the
Mm-hmm.
and explain in a certain way, but the wisdom is involved in not only reading them, but knowing how to apply it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I like that too. Kidner is a shorter book that we're using, but he has some great observations in all three of these books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, that are very astute ideas, and that is one of them. That would go back to what I think I said a little earlier, that the whole process of applying wisdom is to be a reflective process. In a different way from thus says the Lord, which we might just obey blindly because God commands we should do this. We're intended with wisdom, Proverbs included, we're intended to think about these things and to really understand how this truth might fit. Now, I want to lay on you some wisdom, and we'll take our break right after this, that illustrates the idea of an observation. I grew up on a farm in a little community in Washington State called Ridgefield. And here was something that was quite widely talked about that illustrates that some wisdom is local and you would have no idea what it means if you weren't in our little community. Well, at least a community like this. You may not even know what some of these terms mean, but if you live on a farm, you're going to cut the hay field in the summer after the hay grows, and you're going to rake it up, bale it up, bring it into the barn and so forth for the cows. Well, some Ridgefield farm wisdom would have been said like this: you better not mow the field of hay when the heel flies are chasing the cows. Can anybody here make any sense of what this is wisdom. I'm not exaggerating here. This is wisdom. If you're a farmer in Ridgefield, Washington, you better follow this. Any idea of what this might mean? Okay, Sean? You're on the right track on the last one. They're being chased by flies. The heel flies are flies that are very annoying to cows. By the way, the way you know that heel flies are biting the cows, they actually go into the very sensitive part of the hoof of the heel of the cow, and they bite, and it's very painful to the cow. And so you'll see the cows running around with their tails up in the air, actually. They'll be running in the field. That's not a normal thing for a cow to do. So you know when the heel flies are chasing the cows by the way that they're running around in the field. But why? What would that tell you? When the heel flies chase the cows, and here's the part that is a disconnect. It's probably going to rain in the next day. Why? It's farm wisdom. It's probably going to rain. Now, I guess you could use your imagination a bit. The heel flies are biting probably because the humidity is very high. And they're in a situation where they're, for one reason or another, the air condition, the atmospheric conditions are such that the heel flies are going to be biting the cows. When you see the heel flies biting the cows, whatever that atmosphere is, it's going to probably bring rain in the next day. Now, in our area, if the wind is in the south, you better not mow the hay field. Why? Because probably in a day you're going to get rain. Now, you need to know Western Washington, Oregon, it rains all the time. So we can get rain at any time, even in the summertime, if the wind comes from the south. Now, I live in a place right now, when the wind comes from the south, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything different than the wind going from the west or wherever. But the point is, this is local wisdom. And everybody knew it. Everybody who was a farmer knew it. And you looked for some signs in nature to let you predict the weather. And in case you haven't figured it out, you don't want to mow your hayfield when it's going to be raining for several days, because that mown field is going to lay there. It's going to rot. You literally would lose a whole crop of hay if it rains for several days after. So you're waiting for the window of time when you're getting some great weather, warm weather, so you can get your hay into the barn and so forth. Maybe it doesn't seem to you that it has anything to do with Proverbs, but it is the kind of thing that Proverbs are. They are observations about life that are usually true. I would not claim this is 100% true, but I'm going to base my farming practices on this. But if I move to California, it's going to be completely different. So you see, there are observations about life that are observed here that are predictable. They can predict things, except we wouldn't want to press them to be promises. We would say that they're more principles. Okay, well, let's take a break, if you would. There are different kinds of wisdom writings that and this may be a little bit overly simplified, but I think this is a helpful distinctive when we think of understanding biblical wisdom. And that is to think of some writings as more what we would call simple wisdom, and other writings to be in the category of complex wisdom. I think it's pretty obvious when you understand these books why we would call one of them simple and one of them complex. The nature of Proverbs is to describe for us the way life usually works. These would be predictable patterns. We want to stop short. If they're not statements that are grounded in the character and the behavior of God, we're going to want to stop short of saying that this is always the way life is, but we can certainly say, based on simple wisdom, that this is usually the way life is. And the reason we can say that with quite a bit of confidence is it's based on observations over many generations of people and wisdom writers, regardless of their culture, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, culture of Israel, they have observed that this is the way life works. So simple wisdom, like Proverbs, is going to make predictions like that. But we all know that life doesn't always work the way we think it will. And in fact, I know our own stories are probably an illustration of that. And this is where complex wisdom comes in. Job is going to present for us a story of a man who is going through a very normal, well, I shouldn't say normal, his is very extreme trial, excuse me. And if we were to look at the surface of his trial like his friends do, we would say that probably there is a sin in Job's life that led to this problem. Because simple wisdom tells us that God is going to bring discipline on the ungodly. But at the very beginning of Job's story, we're let in on a secret. The first couple of chapters are extremely important, and that is Job is a righteous man, and there's absolutely nothing in Job that has caused this. There's not a sin, a behavior problem that has caused this. So the book of Job is going to explore that whole question of what happens when life isn't predictable and things turn out, in many cases, exactly opposite to the way. Another way to put this is the looming questions in complex wisdom is, why do the righteous suffer? And why do the ungodly people at times have greater success? Those are questions that don't follow the simple wisdom of Proverbs. And yet they are true, that life sometimes works that way. Ecclesiastes is going to go a little different direction. And it's a book that is just brutally honest about someone who has everything in life that you could ever imagine you would want, and he is still very unhappy. There's an unpredictable question, or a question that is unpredictable in life is, what if I did have everything that I wanted in life? Would that still bring me the fulfillment and the happiness that I'm looking for? And Kohelet, the character in the book of Ecclesiastes, and I do think there's a lot of wisdom in this being based on Solomon's life. Whether Solomon wrote it or not is a debated point. I lean myself toward him writing it, but others say that it is based on the character of Solomon, but not necessarily written by Solomon. We'll get to that when we get to the book. This is a question that, again, describes what a lot of people go through in life, especially in a productive, materialistic world. Why is it that when I get everything that I think I'm looking for in life, I'm still not fulfilled? I'm still not happy.
Yeah, it's just about that book. I have a question that I just really want to ask. Solomon's own testimony would be a testimony against his wisdom? I mean, how could such
Yeah.
a wise man fall into, I mean, is that proof? So what's the usage of his wisdom if such a wise man end up in exactly that?
Well, I think you could relate it to Ecclesiastes, but I think just the life of Solomon is this dilemma. How could the wisest man in the world have ended up with such failure as a leader?
Yeah.
Such failure. The kingdom is going to split as a result of Solomon's decisions. I'm not going to answer that for you right now. But I do have an answer.
No, I don't. I just, yeah.
You want me to tell you the answer? I'm going to tell you so you can go home feeling good. In Solomon's case, I think he didn't live out his own wisdom. He made poor choices along the way that didn't follow his own wisdom. I think Solomon sometimes lived wisdom. Early in his life, there's every evidence that he was living wisely. But he became an intellectual expert of wisdom. And yet and here's where we need to develop this a little bit more later. We will when we get to Ecclesiastes. As power and wealth and fame began to place temptations in front of them, he began to compromise on the very things that he taught. And that just illustrates for you, you can know a lot of wisdom, have a knowledge of it, but unless you practice it, you will not ultimately have the success or the fulfillment from it. You look like you're not satisfied there, Franklin.
Because it might be my cultural understanding, because in my understanding, a wise man, or if a man could be called wise, not only he understand it, but he practiced.
He practiced. I would agree with you.
So if he could not practice, he is not wise. He might know. So yeah, it's kind of a dilemma for my own mind.
No, that's a very good observation, and I think, again, if I could appeal to what we're going to study in Ecclesiastes will make this case that the true wise man not only teaches it, but he lives it. And I think there was a period of time in Solomon's life when he did live it, and a period of time when he was pursuing God, and it was at that time God gave him all these things. But his story, totally apart from the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon's story is a great example where you can receive many good things in life, many blessings in life, and not handled correctly, they're going to become a source of downfall. So that will be in part the story in the background of Ecclesiastes. That we see him, and we see the Kohelet, the character in Ecclesiastes, really struggling with this.
But that might just final comment. That might relate to really just what you just quoted from the Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 and 6. That even with such wisdom, could not guarantee that it will be working.
Yep. And let me add my fourth point here, because it's very much to the point. I'm not trying to move on, but this is the point. True wisdom is anchored in what is called in the book of Proverbs, the fear of Yahweh, the fear of the Lord. Remember that key verse, which we're going to get to next week and develop in a little more detail. The fear of Yahweh is the source or the beginning of wisdom. What do we mean? What is packed into the idea of the fear of Yahweh? Well, if we do a study of that word, of the expression, the fear of the Lord in the Old Testament, I think we come up with several components that are important. One of them is it presumes a relationship with Yahweh. It isn't just fearing some God from afar, but the fear of the Lord is presuming a relationship with Yahweh, which Solomon did have, I think. It goes on, though, to talk about the use of this term, the fear of the Lord, of knowing what is good and what is evil, and here's the part, making choices that are going to be consistently obedient to God. It's a choice, a life of obedience that is going to practice the true wisdom. So in Solomon's life, what began to wane in later life and was actually what substituted for it was power and wealth and fame, was his fear of the Lord. This is what began to be lost. Now I want to go to one other level, and that is when we read this, we think of our own little context as Christians. Well, yeah, the fear of the Lord, I mean, that's what life is all about. Read this in the international context of Solomon's day. It's the fear of Yahweh that is the beginning of wisdom. Remember all of those examples that we were reading and citing, the back chapters of Kidner and so forth? Many gods were pursued in these other cultures, and they provided a lot of, not the gods, but the experiences of those cultures provided a lot of wisdom, so that we could go to Egyptian wisdom, or we could go to wisdom of other cultures, and we could find statements that we would truly call wise. But what Proverbs is claiming, and I think all of the wisdom literature claims, is that it's the fear of Yahweh that is going to ultimately take you to the greatest wisdom. Not just any God now, but the fear of Yahweh. And so this is the difference. This last point especially is the difference of Israel's wisdom from the other cultures. It was grounded, it was based in a relationship with Yahweh. The principles that came from it were tied with Torah. They were tied with the revelation that God had given to the people of Israel, and it all became very, very distinct and different. This last point is what God wanted to showcase through Israel to the nations around. The life that they lived. And just like the Queen of Sheba came and was so impressed with Solomon at that point in his life and impressed with his great kingdom, God wanted the nations to be impressed with the life that was lived by Israel. Sadly, for much of their history, that does not happen. It is not an exemplary life, but this was the goal, that true wisdom would be based on the fear of the Lord. Now, I want to finish with one applicational issue today. And this is one of my favorite Time magazine articles. I don't read Time magazine all the time. Posing the question in modern Christian communities, this was in 2006, does God want you to be rich? And the subtitle says, well, yes, say some churches, but others call it heresy. The debate over the new gospel of wealth. And I think you know that there is a debate in theology that some would teach that God intended those promises that we've read in Proverbs, some of those statements, if I am obedient to Him, that He's going to give me, He's going to bless me materially, and He's going to give me a long life and so forth. I asked you to interact with those a little bit earlier. Here's another one of my favorite pictures. Do you remember the Sistine Chapel? Michelangelo's picture of God creating Adam. Here he's passing him a few $100 to do what he needs to do. Does God want us to be rich? Is the wisdom of Proverbs especially, and other parts of Scripture, especially the wisdom literature, is it teaching us that? And here was a question I asked you to interact with a little bit. I know I only gave the group over there a very short time. What do you make of this point of view? That reading those verses in Proverbs, it talks about bringing us prosperity, it talks about bringing health to our body. Therefore, if we don't have prosperity, if we don't have good health, there must be something lacking in our lives. And this person would call it sin. The cause of poverty and sickness must be sin. And if I obey God, He's going to bless me with health and wealth. How do you process that? What do you do when you run into someone who is totally empowered in their Christian life with this principle? Because if you haven't already, you're going to find people who are. They really believe that this is what God wants me to pursue in an environment, obviously, in America where we're able to pursue it. Most of the world aren't able to even think like this, but we are. Which, by the way, the great downturn of the economy a few years ago really shook up a lot of people who have this point of view because these things are not necessarily guaranteed to us. So did you talk about it? What ideas did you come up with? Would you disagree with it? Would you agree with it? If you disagree, would you have a reason for that? Howard, I'm going to look at you. Have any ideas, Howard?
I think in the general principle, and most of the time it should work, but
Okay.
There are many people who do keep God's commandment and they're sick and they're not wealthy and they're not healthy. So it's not a promise.
So you-
the best way is to point to examples of that in the Bible and outside the Bible where people trusted God and yet these things happened.
What examples might you cite in the Bible?
Yeah, Job.
Okay, excellent one. Job's story is going to show us a man who trusted God, was not disobedient. We're let in on some behind-the-scenes information. He's totally obedient to God, and yet God takes everything away from him. Exactly opposite of the way we would think. Some people don't like citing this example, but how much did Jesus own? He didn't even own other than his own clothing, probably. He didn't own anything. Didn't own a home, didn't own any of those things.
We have
Yes, sir.
a problem
David.
actually with one of our members going to another church, and I guess the pastor always preaches this kind of wealth prosperity message without any sin message.
Mhm.
And, he has a problem with that, but yet he likes hearing it because it's a lot of positive speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And I brought up Job's, and he says, "Yeah, you brought that up too. I brought that up to him." He goes, "You see, he blessed them afterwards." I'm like, "Oh."
Yeah, that's often brought up, the
Yeah,
ending
and then,
of the story.
And then I brought up Jesus, and then that's when he was like, "Oh, what do you mean?" I go, "Christ said, even the foxes have holes, but I don't."
Yeah.
And then I brought many things like that. And I think you cleared it up here when you talked about the nature of wisdom, when you said there's also simple things in Proverbs, but also it's complex wisdom in Job and Ecclesiastes. So I
Mhm.
think, I just think it's so easy to claim that, but it's much more to look into when
Mhm.
these guys are just claiming this one prosperity message.
Mhm.
It's easy to say that, but
Mhm.
it's much more behind. Dig into it much.
Let me tell you quick stories about, you're talking about church ministry and churches. The church I served in prior to coming here full-time to teach, I was a senior pastor, preaching pastor of the church. And I don't even remember the passage I was preaching on. I think maybe out of Proverbs. I was preaching one week on stewardship and money, and was making some points about the health and wealth gospel. And a man after he had just visited there for the first time that day, and he asked me if he could have lunch with me that week, and I said, yeah. And he said, I'd like to talk more about your sermon. And so when we went to lunch, we did talk about it, and I came to find out that he was very, very offended by the things that I said about money and the fact that pursuit of money was not what life was all about. And anyway, I could describe more of his situation, but he would be a typical health and wealth gospel kind of guy. And he basically asked me, he said, are you going to preach on that again? Or is this something that you really believe in? Because he said, whether I'm going to come to your church or not is going to relate to what you believe about that. And it was very sad for me to see. I wasn't offensive. I just told him that this is what I believe about our money and our stewardship, and none of us are owners, we're only managers and so forth. And he never showed up again, which was very sad to me because he really had a stumbling block in his way. Another story, a young couple that I counseled who they'd made a really foolish decision about their first child, the birth of their first child. I'm not against having a child at home, but they didn't have the appropriate midwife and so forth to help with the birth of a child at home. And the child got an umbilical cord wrapped around its neck and ultimately had severe brain damage as a result. The child lived, but severe brain damage. And they came in and were talking about all the tragedy they were going through and so forth. It was just a very tragic situation. And this was a couple who had been very active in serving the Lord. And I didn't see him for a while, and I called him and pursued him a little bit and found out that they had now gone on to another church. And in this other church, the teaching that was being given to them is, if you have enough faith in God, your baby will be healed. And I could tell you so many stories of other people whose lives were literally shattered over this belief that if you somehow have enough faith, that God promises that there will be healing, or God promises there will be health. So this is a serious issue. It may not affect the circles that you're in because you're in a good Bible teaching church, but I really think that you will encounter, most of us will encounter, people who are caught into this, and it can seriously affect them. I want to finish by just giving several points that I think point out the fallacy of prosperity theology. And by prosperity theology, I mean also the promise that God will heal, or the promise that I will always be healthy in response to obedience to Him. Most of those who hold to this will appeal to statements in the Old Testament law or to the wisdom books, the ones that we're looking at right now, like Proverbs. And they will transfer those principles over to New Covenant Christian living in the New Testament. I don't believe the New Testament ever gives us the basis for doing that. But rather in the Old Testament, and let me real quickly, I think I have this in your notes there, but in the Old Testament, God gave a very clear relationship to the people of Israel that obedience would be blessed by prosperity, including material prosperity, and disobedience would be disciplined in some way by God. But even the Israelite of the Old Testament under the Old Covenant would have never taken that as an absolute promise, that there would never be an exception to that. However, the principle is there. This is out of Deuteronomy. And those who hold to this often bring that teaching then into the church and claim that just because that appears in Old Covenant giving. As we come to New Testament teaching, I don't believe we're ever promised, if you want to use that word, we're ever promised, that God is going to give prosperity in any way that is close to what He promised to the people of Israel. A second thing, and this is, we can go over rather quickly because we've already talked about it, is to recognize the nature of simple wisdom statements. And that is that they're not to be taken as absolute promises. So there might be factors of life that come to bear. Job's story is an example of a factor of life. And therefore, we cannot take these to be absolute promises that are going to guide everything that are the decisions that we make. And then, Howard, you've already pointed out that we could go to the experiences of a number of biblical characters, like Job, like Jesus, like the apostles, and show that some of the most godly people in the Scriptures did not have a lot, Old or New Covenant life. So to make these claims, you would have to make an exception somehow. And if we're making an exception, we're saying that it isn't always true.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.